Welcome everybody to Next Level Snap. My name is Peaceful. We got with me Lamby here. Lamby, how you doing today, man?
I'm great, man. It's been a while since our last video, but I was really busy streaming during the Twitch Drops anniversary season. It was great. But glad to be back. Glad to be doing this video with you again.
Absolutely, me too, man. And if you guys haven't yet, make sure you get on Twitch. You can watch Lamby stream to get those drops, get your free variant and avatar and all that good stuff. So before we move on into the subject today, which is one that I'm very excited about, I just want to remind everybody that if you are not already subscribed to Lamby's channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button, hit the like button. Let us know down below what sort of topics you'd like to see us do in this series. And without further ado, we are getting back into some advanced snapping techniques. Now, we already did an episode on snapping, and we went pretty deep into some of the basics, I think, of what leads to good snapping techniques. And what we're going to do today is Lamby's going to kind of walk us through just a brief summary of what we covered in that video. There will also be a link to that in the description. And then we're going to dive into some more advanced snap techniques that we think are important to have available to you and to understand how to use those in order to really get that edge up on your opponent. So, Lamby, before we dive into those, why don't you go ahead and give us a brief summary of what we talked about in the first snap video?
Right, so I'm just gonna do a quick one with regards to like the basic snapping techniques that we talked about in our first ever video of this series. So when you snap against your opponent, you want to snap with intention. That's the first and most important thing. You want to snap with intention. You want to know why you are snapping, right? So most of the time, snapping with intention involves snapping with your good hand, snapping with like a good board, like in a good position, snapping a good matchup if you know you're in a good matchup. But for the most part, I think what we cover in the first video is two things. Firstly, being willing to snap when you are in a so-called position of advantage, and also getting value from your snaps, which is like snapping a good hand instead of like when you know you've already won. So basically, you snap a lot of the time when you are holding a card that could turn the game around. That's, I think, the main point of our previous video, and I think a lot of people have benefited from this is snap timing video that we did, and it was really relatively popular as well. So that's why we want to do a follow-up, which is a bit more deep dive into snapping techniques that could help you in your game.
Absolutely. And these are some of the things that I think take you really to that next level where you can really get an edge on a lot of really good players as well. So the first one we're going to talk about is bluff snapping, and I'm gonna hand it over to you, Amy. Like, why don't you kind of walk us through what is a bluff snap? What is that? What do we mean by that? And why it's so important? How to use that effectively in Marvel Snap?
So I'm gonna use a bit of a poker analogy. Analogy first. So like bluffing in general is basically trying to represent something that you are not, right? So you could in Marvel Snap usually you represent two things. You represent strength, or you represent that you are weak, which is something I'll talk about at the end, right? It's a like reverse psychology thing. So representing strength with a bluff snap usually happens when you're in a position where both players know your opponent loses to a specific thing. So now this one's very important because a bluff only works if your opponent knows what to fear. Okay, I'm going to repeat that part again because it's super important. A bluff only works if your opponent knows what they need to fear. So usually bluffs in Marvel Snap, firstly, they don't happen very often. Not many people are doing it, but if you do it, it could give you an edge. Bluffs are very important because if your opponent knows what they lose to exactly, and you are in a situation or they see the situation on the board whereby they can lose to that, sometimes snapping there to represent that you might have said card could get them to retreat. So a very simple example, which everyone knows by now, which is Shuri Red Skull into Taskmaster, right? That's the perfect 4-5-6 curve. Very often when you have Shuri into Red Skull, the first thing on your opponent's mind is, oh, Taskmaster, can I beat that? Right? Because everybody knows what happens with Shuri Red Skull into Taskmaster. It's a lot, gigaton of stats. So snapping when you have Shuri Red Skull, even if you don't have the Taskmaster, will for sure put the thought of Taskmaster in their head, right? So the thing is, when I mentioned earlier at the start of this topic, which is you can only bluff what is known to be feared. You cannot possibly like bluff in another situation whereby you are playing some off the wall deck that no one has seen before, right? No one has any idea what your deck is, and you snap attempting to bluff a winning condition. If your opponent doesn't even know what your winning condition is, they are more likely to just play it out because they can't fathom like, all right, how am I gonna lose from here? If like you're snapping in a losing position, trying to get your opponent to retreat, they will probably be like, why are you snapping me when you are losing and I have no idea why I can lose from here, you know? So like these kind of situations are good if you actually have the secret tag. You actually are holding a special Shang-Chi that no one sees. These kind of situations are good. But if you are snapping to get them to retreat and they have no idea why they can possibly lose here, it likely never work. Likely doesn't work. So this is what I mean by bluffs usually work when your opponent also knows what to fear. On the flip side, of course, there are some bluffs you can make that force your opponent to stay. Now, this is a bit different. This one is a bit harder to do and harder to like plan out. But like sometimes, you know, the whole boomer snap thing. People keep talking about the boomer snap, right? Whereby
Yep.
you snap on turn 6, even if you're in a won position. Sometimes you snap on turn 6 in a neutral position, and they'll be like, oh, why is this person boomer snapping me? Isn't it very clear that it's a 50-50? But then you're actually holding a shank that they don't know that you have, right? Like these kind of things. Then you get them to stay because they'll be like, oh, isn't it just 50-50 where I play my Chavez on turn 6? But actually you have a shank. So like it's different kinds of bluff, right? You must in the same vein of like snapping with a good hand with intention, snapping on bluffs with intention is also super important. You must know why you are like so-called trying to fake them out here, and also know if it's actually logical to fake them out here. This one there's too many scenarios to explain, but like the whole Shuri Red Skull Taskmaster one, and way back when Silver Surfer was pre-nerf, everyone knew Silver Surfer was coming down on turn 6 for like a +3 on everything, right? Like, and they would math it out as well. They would count it out as well. So when it's long story short, when it's very obvious what your opponent can lose to, a bluff can potentially work because they are already thinking about possibly losing to it before you even snap. So yeah, that's basically the essence of bluff snapping, which is not very common in Marvel Snap, but I've done it many times, especially in tournaments when there's high stakes. And when it's high stakes, people tend to take less risk because there's a lot on the line. And like when you snap, their first thought is, oh, they are showing strength. They have Taskmaster, gotta get out, that kind of thing.
Well, yeah, and one of the another slight use case, very similar to what you're talking about, that comes up a lot, especially on ladder with like something like Galactus. Like I used to snap all the time after I pull off a Galactus. Like you don't always draw the perfect hand, right? Like sometimes you're missing null. Back in the day when you played death, you're missing death. So I would go into that final
Goliath
turn
now.
and yeah, Alioth now. That's actually a great current example. So maybe you don't actually have Alioth in hand, but your opponent can never beat Alioth on turn 6. So instead of risking the 50-50, you can snap them. And like most of the time, a good player will say, well, there's no way I beat Goliath. They clearly have it. I'm going to leave because, you're playing Thanos. You've locked down one lane. That takes the risk out of it for you and guarantees that you at least get that. Maybe it's 2 cubes, maybe it's, 1 cube, but whatever. That's another way you can really use this to your advantage. And I think one thing that we really should emphasize that you said, but I'm going to emphasize it again. This only works if your opponent understands that's like understands the important things about snap. Like if you're playing on ladder before infinite and you're not sure like the skill level of your opponent, yes, there's MMR, but you might still be playing against somebody who's maybe not at that upper echelon of snap. Sometimes it's going to go right over their head. They just think you're snapping because of whatever, and then you're going to get punished. So just be careful using this. Make sure you're using it in a situation that you're pretty sure your opponent is going to respect what you're doing, because if they're not going to respect the fact that you might actually have what it is, if they're just going to play it out because that's what they've shown they're going to do, then your bluff snap's going to end up backfiring.
I'm gonna add one last quick point since you mentioned that. Player-based snapping as well, which is like, for example, in Conquest, if you know that your opponent is relatively what's that called? Reserved and less aggressive, or less like a calling station, they are less likely to stay to snaps, right? Sometimes just snapping instead of when you have a good hand, snapping when they like miss their curve, there's a very good chance they'll retreat as well, because like if you notice that they're a conservative player, like this is a bit about tendencies which we talked about in another video, but yeah, sometimes snapping just because they are a reserved player and they miss their curve could also get them to retreat. That's not really a bluff, that's like a semi bluff, but essentially it's the same thing.
Yep, absolutely. All right, we're gonna move on to our next subject here, location-based snaps, and we've touched on this before in some other episodes, but we're gonna get into basically how to use location RNG, both positive and negative, to your advantage when snapping early. And Lammy, why don't you guys go ahead and kind of get into this subject for us and kind of introduce it to the viewer?
Right. So actually, this particular topic, I don't have really much to say because at the end of the day, it's very leaning a bit into that whole semi-bluff thing, which I talked about at the end of the previous topic, which is you're snapping on locations that support you slash negatively affect your opponent. Like for example, the one I always use, like Onslaught Citadel when you're playing a Patriot deck. If you snap on this, they know, especially in Conquest, right? Like if they know you're a Patriot deck, and you snap on Onslaught Citadel, they'll just instinctively think of, oh, Patriot on that location is crazy strong. So they might just retreat because they can't beat that much stats when there's Onslaught Citadel on the board. Another thing about location-based snapping is which also leans a bit hard into the semi-bluff thing, which is you might not even have the card, but because the location is known to benefit you or negatively affect them, they will just retreat and you get some free like cubes just by snapping on good or bad locations. Another thing to talk about also, which is even more of a disguise, especially on ladder and in like the early rounds of Conquest, right? Which is if you run a specific tech card, gonna use the most easy one here, which is Luke Cage, right? Snapping on negative power locations, locations that like make your cards go negative power while you're holding or have Luke Cage in your deck is very hard to read. Because like they would have to literally assume that you have Luke Cage, especially if they have not seen any other cards, right? So there's a good chance that you can like get them to stay and like get your Luke Cage to benefit in the future. So this one's a bit about location-based snapping plus also like secret tech card snapping. But at the end of the day, the whole point with location-based snapping is you don't just want to snap a bit referencing back to our first video, which is you don't just want to snap a good like game state or snap like a good hand. You also want to snap when it's good for your potential draws or like cards that your opponent don't know you have that benefit from said location.
Absolutely. And a lot of times you can also use this, like you said, in coordination with bluff snaps. Like an example that I absolutely loved is back when Electro Ramp was a big part of the metagame. If your opponent knew you were on Electro Ramp and Oscorp Tower shows up, you just wait till turn 3, you snap,
Exactly.
and like with a bad hand, like I have no wave, I have no Electro, I have no play on turn 3, but I snap, and they basically just have to leave because if you get an Electro in that spot and give it to them, they just it's almost impossible for them to win. So there's a lot of mind games you can use with locations. Crimson Cosmos is a big example right now where a lot of decks just can't play into that location when it comes on, especially all the bounce decks and stuff. So you can really use that to your advantage early, even if you don't have a super strong hand. And I think that's where location based snapping can be really important. All right, last topic of the day. This is actually the one I'm most excited about, the counter snap. So this is something that doesn't come up all that often because, like we've kind of talked about in several of our videos, people tend to not like. There's a lot of people who play very reserved, or don't necessarily like to snap. But sometimes you're playing against somebody with similar mindset to you, and you snap them turn 2 because you just have the nuts hand, and they counter snap you, so they snap back. So we just kind of want to talk about what your thought process should be in that situation, what you should do when that happens, what you should be thinking about, and how it should impact your plays from that point. So
Right. So I'm gonna go into one thing first, and I'm going to go into another more important thing, which is like one of my trade secrets. So you really should watch this video. So the first thing is in Marvel Snap, after playing this game for so many months, right? No one really bluffs the counter snap. Like I can count on one hand how many people bluff the counter snap. Like if you snap and someone instantly snaps you back, very rarely they have nothing. Like this is a Marvel Snap. This is Marvel Snap, not poker. So very rarely they have nothing, right? So first things first, get it out of the way first. If someone counter snaps you, like on the same turn that you snap, very likely you both just wanted to click it anyway, but you clicked it first. So
yeah,
that's really basically what counter snapping is. Marvel. That's not really counter snapping. That's just like both tend to snap at the same time. But no, going deeper into the counter snap, which is one of my biggest trade secrets, because I treat Marvel Snap as a value extraction game, right? Like cube extraction game. It's not about the number of wins you have, it's the amount of cubes you win over time. And if that's positive, you're doing something right. So counter snapping is actually one of the best cube extraction strategies ever. Because firstly, let's put it into perspective. If somebody snaps you, like for whatever reason, most of the time it's they have a good hand, they're in a good situation, blah blah blah. So if you are staying for that, you already know they kind of have something good going for them, right? So to counter snap this, to snap them back when they've snapped you first, it means you are also representing a good hand, and very good chance this is gonna go down to 8 cubes, unless something causes them to retreat for 4, like a third location that hasn't been revealed and both players snap and snap back already. But like for the most part, when you counter snap, you are expecting to play down to 8. So why this is a very good way to extract value from your opponent in terms of cubes is that when they snap you because of their good hand, you can like just, if your hand is decent as well, you can be a bit more reserved. You can just say, okay, my hand is decent, I'm gonna stay, I'm gonna play it out a bit. But when you are playing out such games, you have to actively look to counter snap, because the thing about counter snapping is that when you do it and your opponent snapped first, your opponent is very likely to stay because they are representing strength, correct? So when you snap them back, their first thought in their head is, okay, so they are also showing strength, but my hand is already strong, that's why I snapped first. So I will probably stay. Most of the time when someone snaps and I counter snap, it's more often that they stay than they leave. So to extract a lot of cubes from your opponent, you have to actively play with the idea of thinking of counter snapping them after their snap. Like play with that intention. And if the situation arises that you can set that up, counter snap them at the right timing as well. So let's put it, let's give a very simple example that everyone will understand, which is, let's say someone snaps you on turn 1 or 2, maybe they have a very strong curve. You're playing Shuri Sauron, right? You probably have the Shuri and Taskmaster in hand. Maybe you don't have the Red Skull yet. But before turn 4, let's say you draw your Red Skull. So now you have Shuri, Red Skull, Taskmaster. You know they don't run Shang-Chi, for example. That's the perfect curve, right? So they already snapped you. So what you want to do here is you want to snap them before you play the Shuri. Snap them before you play the Shuri. And since they snapped you first, they feel like they're strong. They will stay. Then you show the Shuri, then you show the Red Skull, then you show the Taskmaster. Or even if you don't have to show the Taskmaster, they might retreat already for 4 because they knew that, oh, I snapped into Shuri, Red Skull. But actually, you were already planning to snap them back, right? That's why they got caught in a weird situation where they had to retreat for 4. So I think without like going too deep into this as well, when you counter snap somebody, you have the intention to catch them off guard because they know for sure they are strong. But the counter snap puts you in a position whereby you are setting up to be stronger than them. So, long story short, I think when you counter snap, you must have the intention to like one up what is their best play. Always think about, if you counter snap, don't just do it because you feel strong, but you must know exactly what you want to do to one up their good hand. Because if they snap you first, it's definitely a good hand. So to counter snap, you need to know how to like look at your hand and see if there's a position where you can one up their good hand. And very often they will stay because firstly they show strength first, and people don't like to retreat after they show strength. It's just a
Yeah,
thing, you know.
it's a
So
human
that's
nature.
one of my biggest trade secrets, because like people don't like to retreat after they show strength. So if you're in a position where you can sort of outpower their strength or their so-called good hand, you should counter snap them because they are likely to play along and then you extract the value from them. Of course, sometimes you may have made a misread, or sometimes things just don't go your way even after your counter snap. It's unfortunate, but it's still okay to retreat for 4. It's not great, but like you are trying to practice value extracting from your opponent, extracting the cubes from your opponent. So if you see there's a chance to counter snap and get more from them, do it. It takes practice. Sometimes even if you practice, it doesn't always work. But it's a good thing to keep in the back of your mind when you stay after a snap, because at the end of the day, you're trying to extract more cubes from them.
Absolutely. That's a lot of great stuff there. I think, people tend to like when their opponent snaps first, like, I don't know, want to just play it out and see what happens, but there is a lot of value in getting that upper hand on them because I don't think most times when people snap, they're not expecting their opponent to snap right back. So, like you said, you can kind of put them in this weird position where like, wait, they know I have a good hand, but they snap me. And it just puts them like where it kind of puts them on like, I don't know, at least for me, I get very uneasy when my opponent immediately snaps me back when I snap because you're kind of hoping you have the upper hand and then suddenly they're like snapping right back at you. It just, there's that mental side of it as well. So just the one follow-up question, do you do anything differently in the opposite example? So where you have snapped and your opponent is the one counter snapping you, what's sort of your process in that? Does anything change for you, or do you kind of play it out the same way you would have beforehand?
I think when I play casually, like on stream, or when I'm not like in like super serious mode, when people snap me back, there's a lot of times that you've ended your turn already because like it's like stream, you don't want to like rope every single game, but like if it's tournament, right? I tend to take the full turn timer every single time. Well, not full, like almost the full turn timer, because there's always that interesting possibility that like someone also knows how to do the rope snap. They snap you at the end, or you just they were already intending to counter snap you because they expect you to snap first. This one is super high level. Not many players do this, so I tend to just generically use the whole rope timer to think about if I snap here and they snap back, what does that mean? You know, that kind of thing. That I've done it a few times whereby I snap, they snap me back, I insta retreat, that kind of thing. Like it's
Mhm.
very rare, but I've done it a few times. And also, I think if I'm playing from the position whereby if I snap first and they snap me back, whether it's on the same turn or the turn after, I will really take time to evaluate why they snap me back, right? Like if it's conquest, I will relook at the deck list to see. I mean, if it's tournaments, I'll relook at the deck list to see if there's anything I'm missing here, anything that I suddenly lose to, despite showing strength. You know, I think the most important thing to evaluate when someone snaps you back, which is why you should really use the whole turn timer to think, which is if they snap you back and I already showed strength, what can they possibly do in the next few turns that beat the amount of strength that I'm showing? If like I'm showing you Shuri and I'm snapping on Shuri, they would probably expect Red Scout Taskmaster, but they still snap me back. Are they trying to like throw initiative to shank it? Are they trying to cosmo my Taskmaster? You know, these kind of things. Then you look at the deck list, especially for tournaments, to see if they have such a possibility. Or on ladder's a bit harder, or like Conquest, because like if they snap you back, you just have to assume sometimes that they are hiding some tech that could screw up your complete perfect hand. And it's very weird, but like, believe it or not, right? Every time someone snaps back, right, there is a good chance that they already got you beat because they don't do it very often. People naturally don't snap back, at least from what I've experienced. They don't snap back as often as I think like good players usually sometimes can do. So if the general player snaps you back, very often they've already got like the cards to have you beat. So the mindset and the process is, all right, so they probably already got me beat. Is there anything in my hand or any of my draws that could beat the thing that is trying to beat me? You know, it's many
Yeah.
levels of like of that kind of thing. Like you just have to make this kind of assumptions sometimes. But like at the end of the day, I think the easiest thought to have is that if they snap you back, they probably think they already got you beat. So with what I have, can I beat the thing that they are using to try and beat me? It's like level 3, right?
Yeah.
So level 1 is you beat them, you snap. Level 2 is they beat you back, they snap you back. And level 3, which is what you need to think about, is can I beat the thing that is trying to beat me? And we can assume that they already have it. So yeah.
Yeah, it gets really deep, and it's like you said, you kind of have that read on them, unless you're playing in open decklist tournaments. That's the one thing I do love about open
Mhm.
decklist tournament is usually when they counter snap you, you can look right at their deck and figure out basically exactly what they're planning to do, based on the locations and what cards they have in their deck. But it gets a little trickier in conquests because you don't necessarily know, and people like to run really weird cards in conquest that you're not expecting. So you kind of have to really think on that next level. But it's good stuff. All right. So that's really the three main things we wanted to talk about today. Lammy, why don't you give us some closing thoughts? Give us sort of a summary of what you want people to take away from this first video we're doing of probably many on some advanced snapping techniques.
All right, so I'm just going to run through everything we talked about in like shorter examples. So firstly, check out our first video, which will be linked in the description on like basic snapping techniques. Those will carry you a long way. And if you want to go even deeper dive into all these snapping stuff, today we talked about bluff snapping, which is most important point you want to take away is when you bluff, when you try to bluff, bluff with intention, and also bluff when both sides know what your opponent can lose to, right? Don't bluff when no one knows what's going on. Bluff when you already know they fear something, which is like Shuri, Red Scout, Taskmaster. Everyone knows to fear that, for example. Location-based snapping, it's more of like snapping with what you could have and not so much of snapping with what you already have. Because like Onslaught Citadel, for example, you're running a Patriot deck. You may not have the Patriot in your hand, but at both sides, especially in like Conquest or tournaments, they already know you are a Patriot deck. So snapping an Onslaught Citadel could force a retreat because they know you're a Patriot deck that benefits heavily from a said location. And then last but not least, the counter snap is very interesting because the counter snap is not used a lot, and many people don't know how to use this or evaluate this. But in general, a counter snap or like a snapback in Marvel Snap represents strength from your opponent over your strength, which is basically saying that they got you beat despite you having a good hand, right? That's the
Yeah.
general idea with a counter snap. So to stay after a counter snap, to combat a counter snap, which usually ends up going to eight cubes, is basically saying that like you have a good hand, their snap indicates they beat your good hand. You have like the other additional cards or strategy to beat their counter. And if you do, you could stay. Maybe they also stay because they don't know that you have the counter to their counter. So that's essentially what counter snap means. And I feel like counter snapping, one more thing is that you extract a lot of value from your opponent, especially if they snap first. Because generally people don't like to retreat after showing strength. So if you counter snap with a game plan that can beat their game plan, they are often gonna stay and you could take a 4 or 8 cuber win.
It's great. Okay, I think that's a beautiful summary. I think we're going to wrap it up right there. Lammy, thank you so much as always. I really appreciate doing these videos with you. I feel like I learned so much. Hopefully the same for you who are watching this right now. Please let us know in the comments what other topics you'd like to see so we can make sure we get those covered for all of you. And Lammy, as always, it's a pleasure.
Take care.
Yep. Take care, everybody. We'll see you next time.